Knowing how to think empowers you far more than people who only know what to think. An important statement of philosophical fact expounded by the person who we are going to speak with today. When I was 12 years old, this was 1997, bored with the routine rigmarole of our science syllabi, I wrote an article for our school magazine on time dilation, the experimentally proven fact that time slows down the faster you go or under immense gravity. We all now understand this from Miller's Planet from the movie Interstellar. I didn't end up as a man of science. I'm sitting here today instead. But through Stephen Hawking and Leonard Susskind and many others, I've had the privilege of traveling through science from the great to the tiniest up and down quarks. It's a journey of the mind's eye. It's a journey that requires curiosity, fascination, and a sense of awe. It's a journey that's part science, part philosophy, and part an enigmatic tale. Carl Sagan took us through that journey, through the cosmos. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson has. He's authored and co-authored more than a dozen books, including his latest called Starry Messenger, A Cosmic Perspectives on Civilization. He's hosted TV series. Infamously, he's one of the reasons why my school books that told us there were 9 planets is now outdated. He's not only an astrophysicist, but he's a storyteller. Neil deGrasse Tyson, thank you for joining us on NewsX.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I don't live up to that introduction now. That's, we're done.
Dr. Tyson, we know we're not done because I'm going to begin at something that I know is going to connect with you. And believe it or not, all right, I've done this on Indian television several times before. Live TV we do every day here. I've done it with my teams that work with us as journalists. So I'm going to put an image on your screens, ladies and gentlemen. This is something truly special. In February 1990, when I was less than 5 years old, and the spacecraft Voyager was almost 6 billion kilometers from Earth, Carl Sagan asked the team to point the camera back. What emerged was a photograph of Earth less than 1 pixel wide. It's called the pale blue dot. Sagan would later write, and I'm quoting this, "Consider again that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you've heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king, every peasant." On your screens, let me mark it out. This photograph, less than 1 pixel wide. Neil deGrasse Tyson, put this into perspective for us, sir.
Yeah, I don't know that I can improve on Carl Sagan's poetic prose. That appeared in his book, The Pale Blue Dot, published shortly after that photo was taken. That photo, he had to convince NASA to turn the camera back towards the inner solar system to take the picture of Earth. And in a way, that's like Earth's first selfie. I want to think about it like that, because it's our spacecraft and it's taking a picture of us. That picture would be reprised with a sort of a pale blue dot, a latter day pale blue dot version of that by the Cassini spacecraft at Saturn. And since the cameras are better today than back then, it's more than 1 pixel. It's like a few pixels wide, but it's still just there, this tiny spot adrift in space with no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. And so this is also phrasing that you will find in the Pale Blue Dot book, where it's up to us to solve our problems. And so that is a cosmic perspective like none other. And so there are other cosmic perspectives that one can talk about, but that one is, I think, reigns supreme. Here's another quick cosmic perspective, that the ingredients of our body the carbon and the nitrogen and the oxygen, these are all forged in the cores of stars that exploded billions of years ago, scattered that enrichment. They were manufactured there by thermonuclear fusion, scattered that enrichment into pristine gas clouds, out of which subsequent generations of star systems would be born, including ours. And so we are not just figuratively or poetically stardust, we are literally stardust.
I've
And
also
so,
heard you speaking about every water molecule that's been through all of us and everybody who's ever lived as another great example. Dr. Tyson,
yes,
finish your thought.
we're
Finish your thought.
sharing this biosphere of air molecules and water molecules that recycle through and through. So, yes, the water that you drink has, it's weird to say this, but true, passed through the kidneys of people who lived on Earth 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. We have a connectivity deeper than you might imagine.
Dr. Tyson, you had the opportunity for a very brief meeting with our Prime Minister Narendra Modi just a couple of days ago. What's the impression that you got?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. He called for the meeting, by the way. One doesn't just say, "I'd like to meet the head of state of the largest country in the world." So I have no such power to request such a meeting. I think he was interested in chatting with me because he knew my views on space exploration. India has had forays into space, and the most successful of which was into orbit around Mars. And becoming the third or fourth country only to do that, or space agency to do that. And so I was invited to Indian television back when that occurred. And there was on the journalists, I think they conveyed some sentiments of people where they said, well, there's so much poverty in India. How do we justify this kind of expense? And then I think he liked my responses because, or found them intriguing or worth wider audience because that in fact inspired him to ask to meet me while he was in New York City, where I am based. And so he's very interested in space. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. He shared with me his ideas and plans to commercialize space exploration. Space exploration, if it's only paid by the government, is a space program. But if there's a commercial motivation for it, then it becomes a space industry. And that then stokes an economy and creates jobs, high quality, high level jobs in your environment. And so he chatted about that. He liked my access to people to get them interested in science. And he shared with me some ideas he had about creating, if they're not already getting put into place, these exploration zones for children where they can go in and just explore nature, the forces of physics and science and chemistry. And it's a place where they can express their curiosity, which is fundamental to what it is to be a child. We were all, even if by the time you're an adult, it's gone, we all as children were curious. So that's the time to stimulate this. And yeah, I also gifted him one of my books called Space Chronicles, Facing the Ultimate Frontier, which is every thought I've ever had about our past, present, and future in space. And I inscribed it to him, and I said to Prime Minister Modi, for whom not even is the sky the limit. And so he smiled at that. And then I would learn that 2 days later in Washington, during his press conference with President Biden, he would recite part of that quote,
Yes,
speaking of India's ambitions. So that was a fascinating little bit of exchange there, I found.
Yeah, well, thank you for taking the meeting and thank you for taking the interest in even having this conversation. For people watching this broadcast, wherever you're watching it, there are some fascinating things happening in India. Believe it or not, the LIGO experiment that is trying to measure gravitational waves is now planning a project in India. We are planning our second spaceport in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu. which is going to be larger than the first one we have. So there are very interesting things, Dr. Tyson, that are coming up. But for people, and you'll know this, there is a large Indian diaspora working in NASA. We've been involved in the CERN project in Geneva. How has been your interaction with people from the Indian community, the Indian American community working in science?
Yeah, I mean, I've had Indian colleagues forever, and so, but more broadly, Asian colleagues. So South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and so the interest in space, the interest in science and pushing the frontier of science is not localized to one country. Yes, we have opportunity here, and so people might be attracted to it. But for anyone to say, well, this is just our country's thing. No, we have brains. Human brains are everywhere. And one of the greatest challenges throughout history is there equal access to opportunity? Because if you only grant access to one group and not another, you are not taking full advantage of the intellectual capital of our species. And the fact that India is building a LIGO place, a LIGO telescope, we call them a telescope, it's observing waves of gravitational energy rippling through the universe. The value of that is you can combine it with LIGO centers in other places around the world, and if they all measure the same event, the time difference between these centers is an indication. They can use that and triangulate on exactly where it's happening in the sky. And so this is an international collaboration, something fundamental to science. And so anytime we see opportunities denied one community or another, I feel like we're not advancing as much as we possibly could as a people.
Right. I have to ask this question for people again watching this broadcast, because the world has been dominated in science over the past few years by that CERN experiment, the hunt for the Higgs boson. As many of you would know, and I know Dr. Tyson would know, the word boson comes from Satyendranath Bose. There was an Indian physicist by the name of C.V. Raman, who also won a Nobel Prize in physics, and this was on light scattering, on wavelengths of light as they transfer through various mediums. So we've had a footprint there. We've had the Vikram Sarabhais and the Homi Bhabhas who built our space research organization, which is now called ISRO. But we have 600 million young people in this country who are under the age of 25, sir. It's about sparking the imagination, and that's something that you do really well. How can we do that better?
So that's a great question. So different people, I think, get inspired by different forces operating on them. For me, it was just looking up, wow, I don't know anything that's going on up there. It is an immense frontier. I want to jump in with both feet. That worked for me. But for some people, again, getting back to the poverty issue, suppose instead you look up and say, I have cultural ancestors in the Indian subcontinent who cared about that long ago. There were great advances in the Hindu culture for mathematics and astronomy. And then you look at that and say, wow, they cared about it back then. Maybe I can continue that tradition going forward. And so those taproots can have immense influence and power over people's ambitions. By the way, of course, 1 out of 7 Indian citizens are Muslim. And the golden age of Islam from 1,000 years ago can be referenced with the Islamic community, where great advances in mathematics and algebra and engineering and astronomy and navigation. And all of these are useful going into space. So when I see India's ambitions going into space, where all the frontiers of science are reached by that, it's like a gateway field. Where you go into space, I care about the surface of the moon, I need a geologist. I want to look for life on Mars, I need a biologist. I need a new spacecraft that has new utility, I need an engineer. So you look at how fertile that ambition is, and you bring everybody together on that. There's no greater force operating on the peace and tranquility of the world than people coming together and collaborating and seeing space as the destination of our species rather than of one country or another.
You know, it's a fascinating exercise. I've interviewed our federal minister who handled the Space Department 3 times in the past 6 months. Recently, just a couple of days ago, we also had our chairman of our Indian Space Research Organization, including the former chairman who did that mission to the moon, which unfortunately could not land at the last split second. You know, India has just got its space policy drafted. Our Space Research Organization has just opened up almost all of its research and R&D materials to private companies. 24 private companies are now listed. There is Agnicool, there is Pixel, and Bellatrix. Dr. Tyson has just done our first private sector rocket launch. Now, I know it's a much smaller scale than SpaceX and others, but things are moving rapidly, and trust me, for me to see them in India moving this rapidly shows that there is a lot of potential here, hopefully.
Yeah, so it's the fact that, by the way, it takes administrative governmental enlightenment to say it's not just going to be the government. We are generally, for something expensive and big, the government does it first because it's harder to make a business model out of it. But once the government does it and establishes the risks, the costs, the return, then the business can come afterwards and say, oh, I can use this piece of it and these patents and these innovations for this idea that I have that no one else had before. This is the value when you have such a huge population that's motivated. People come up with thoughts that you never thought you'd have using the technology that was pioneered by an enlightened government leadership in that role. So yes, that's all there. And by the way, there's another element of this. As you described the diaspora of India, all right, well, why did they leave? Because they had an opportunity in some other place on Earth. To the extent that India provides those same opportunities or better opportunities, then they won't leave India, they'll stay in India. All right. So then you wouldn't be losing this intellectual capital. So in the end, I'd be sad that we don't get them, but in the end, it's better for India. And I think the world wants to see India succeed here as now the largest populated country in the world as of a couple of months ago.
Yes, I have a couple of technical questions because I know our time is short. We've joined the Artemis program. So the Artemis Accords, you know, what purpose will that serve?
Yes. So the Artemis Accords, I view it as sort of an updating. It's slightly different, but personally, I view it as an updating of the space treaty that was drafted back in the 1960s. Right? There was an international space treaty back then, which was very, oh, we'll go into space and we'll all do nice things. And it was very hopeful, but it still has the DNA of the 1960s. And that was 60 years ago. So it was clearly time to revisit that, rethink it, given the actual access to space that's happening today, and with satellites and with people and countries and anti-satellite weaponry. How do we make sense of all of this so that we can all share space into the future? And so I mentioned to your prime minister, because at the time I spoke with him, that India had not yet signed the Artemis Accord, and 25 other countries had. And so we were concerned because it was like, India, are you going to get on board here or what? And so I would learn that 48 hours later, yes, in a small ceremony, the Artemis Accord was signed by India. And I had mentioned this to the prime minister, that it would be a good thing to sign it. And I think they were already going to sign it at that point, but I wanted to make sure he knew that I cared.
So let me follow up on an even more technical question, because space in the 1960s, space today, a lot different, right? I mean, at a certain stage, if we are setting up our own navigational system called NavIC, which is going to be working in South Asia and do something similar to what GPS does, providing satellite communications and internet, these low Earth orbits, tens of thousands per system. Eventually, we run out of space. There's too much debris. So this will have to, some agreement will have to be found at a certain space. How do we get closer to that?
Yeah, so there are baby steps we can take. So, for example, if you put up a satellite and the satellite has lived out its useful life, then you have to have a reserve of fuel to slow it down out of that orbit and have it come back and re-enter the atmosphere where it can then burn up safely over the Pacific. So that would be a way to dispose of satellites that have lived out their useful lives. So much of what's up there does not have this capacity. And so that's a bad thing. And eventually, yes, it's too crowded. I joke, people say, where are the aliens if, there's plenty of time for them? And I say, they looked at Earth and saw how much garbage we have orbiting Earth and decided not to land. And they said, let's find another planet. Yes, this is all that's why we need to cooperate. To talk about how do you get rid of trash, garbage, dead satellites, because you can't do that unilaterally. It doesn't work.
Okay. An announcement has also been made by the US president that there will be Indian going on to the ISS next year. I know the ISS now has a limited lifespan, but in terms of inspiring people, maybe even doing a telecast from space with students here in India, how important are these things?
So I can tell you there is no substitute for an astronaut of your nationality to go up into space and communicate from space and then come back. Okay? We've had robots go places, but no one gives parades for robots. Nobody names schools after robots. It's the human being that you can relate to, that can come back and tell a story, the person who felt what it was like to go into space. Do not underestimate the value of having Indian astronauts, just in general, but of course participating in the International Space Station and beyond.
Yeah,
by the way.
And we've had Indian origin people. I mean, we tragically
yes, of course,
lost, yeah, Kalpana Chawla in Colombia. But we also now are planning our own crewed mission. And I know you mentioned baby steps, so we've taken the baby steps. I can tell you that just last month, the first sort of mock-up of the aeroframe design was tested in the Indian southern state of Karnataka. So it's baby steps. We're a long way off. But putting people into space and perhaps even a new push for the moon, has the time come, sir?
Yeah, and I think the solar system is our backyard. And look, I predict the day, I hope, this is a hope prediction, that the day comes where the solar system is our backyard and we have access to its resources in a way that prevents the future of all wars on Earth fought over access to limited resources. Because in space, there is no limit to the resources, to the energy. The rare earth elements are common on asteroids, on chosen asteroids. There's all manner of, the comets are filled with water, all right? We have people ready to fight over access to water on Earth's surface. So that's the kind of future I seek here. And it's not that far off. It's not like, how are we ever going to get to space, which is what we used to think in the 1940s and 50s. We have an SUV-sized rover driving around on Mars. Access to space is not the issue. It's whether we're motivated to make that our future.
Would it be your suggestion or your thought that going ahead and once we can and develop the capacity, it might take another decade, because crewed missions to space are completely different from what we're doing right now. But to have a permanent presence there, to have a permanent presence, maybe a space station?
A decade is not long. I mean, think about it. And it's not over ambitious. When President Kennedy said, before we had a spacecraft that ever launched a human being, he said, we're going to put a man on the moon before the decade is out. And so within 8 years of that speech, we went from no aircraft that could carry a person to 3 astronauts at the moon. And so it's possible if you're motivated, and you know that you're not trying something that's never been tried before. So that helps. But I want to add that the sending that when you, as you build all of the frontiers that enable you to gain access to space, like I said, it touches different industries. The medical industry. What is the health of your astronauts? And what are you searching for? And how and why? You need experts in that entire spectrum of exploration. And there's no greater force to lift a nation up and out of states of poverty or despair. And by the way, I've spoken with people from our own State Department, and they made it clear that India is on a path, and we're here to help, but we're not here to lead you because you don't need leadership. You have the scientists and engineers and the like. It's not like America in the 1950s where we didn't know how to go into space. We used German rocket pioneers to do that. All right. We had the money and the resource, but we didn't have the intellectual capital. India has the intellectual capital. So we're there to help out as necessary. And in that sense, we become more like partners rather than a guide with India's ambitions.
Okay, just another quick thought on a more practical purpose, because of all the information that is already available from space, including high resolution imagery, there's almost seems to be a lot of data, and we still need to catch up on how to put that data to use. You know, remote sensing has been a terminology that has been in the vogue for the past 40 years, but real-time imagery, you know, you mentioned, you know, people who require developmental assistance. Well, that's your farmers here in India who need better weather forecasting, who can do crop monitoring, you know, from with satellite imagery. Where is the future looking back, using space, looking back on Earth for practical applications?
Yeah, I mean, that's people. There's the exploration part, and then there's the obvious practical part that gets into place immediately. India has monsoons like no other country, right? So you want to know what that is and predict it, and know how severe it is, know how light it's going to be, know how to anticipate, how to respond to what you know it will be. This requires climate and weather modeling, for example. Farming, there's something today called precision farming, with a satellite informs a system of irrigation tools that it says, oh, the crops are a little dry, and it sets the water to go irrigate it. It looks like there's a blight coming in on the side corner, and then it fumigates. This communication, especially for wide area farming, has transformed the productivity and the success of the farming industry. So that's just one little piece of the value that accessing space will bring. Not to mention, like you said, the access to the internet, access to, like you said, the GPS counterpart in India. You want to provide navigation tools for people. So it's all good, all of it.
Yeah, very seriously, it can be civilization changing. We've run out of time, deGrasse Tyson, but I look forward for an opportunity to hosting you in India. It'll be a privilege for us to fly you down and meet with some of the best new companies that are emerging out of the aerospace industry, venturing into space here in India. Pleasure talking to you, sir. Thank you for your time.
And thank you for your interest. Yes.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.